Good morning and welcome to today's Reform Think Tank webinar. I'm very excited to say we have a fantastic set of speakers for you. I think we're going to have a brilliant conversation. The topic, as you all know, is a new economic settlement, how to rebuild the social contract. Now I'm going to properly introduce our panelists, Caroline, Martin and Nick, in a moment, as well as the subject of the discussion this morning. But for anyone who's been at a Reform Think Tank event before, you'll know that there can be a bit of a lag between us going live and all of you guys actually being able to see and hear us. So partly because we're fascinated in your opinions, genuinely, but also partly because it just gives us a bit of time to wait for everyone to come through. I'm going to start with a quick poll, which I'm going to launch now. Hopefully you can all see this. If you can cast your votes, please. So what we want to know, you've got a long list of different potential things that government might be able to help do something about. Let's put it that way. Obviously not entirely in government's gift to achieve these things, but certainly can play a role in it. What do you think across government and business should be no more than 2 priorities, please? Now, I'm sure there's lots of people thinking, well, this is ridiculous because all of these things should be done, or actually there's a whole set of things that should be done that aren't captured in this poll. But just humour me with this. If you can just pick no more than 2, so we can see where people's thinking is in terms of priorities, that would be brilliant. And I can see the polling proportion of people voting is going up. So just while people do vote, I do think panelists can vote if you would like to. It is anonymous, so don't worry, I'm not going to be able to say, oh, you know, Martin voted this way or whatever. So if you'd like to give your views, you're more than welcome to. Just while we have that vote then, I'm just going to run over briefly a few logistics. Again, I'm sure everyone's been on already a gazillion Zoom webinars, but just in case anyone hasn't, if you hover your cursor over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see there is a little button that says Q&A. Please do put your questions in there for panelists. We will try and get through as many as possible. But please don't put your questions into the chat function because we won't be monitoring that live. So just to repeat, make sure if you've got any questions for our panelists, you're welcome to start putting those in now or wait till they've done their opening remarks. Then please use that Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Also, please do tweet. One of the things that has dropped off in the transition from physical events into online events is people tweeting. We do have a hashtag. It is #socialcontract. We have what I think is very helpfully given you each of our speakers' Twitter handles on the screen. So in each of the little video boxes, you can see those. I'm sure there are many, many more people who would love to hear the wisdom and insight of our speakers today than just the group of people who've managed to get a place to listen live. So please do tweet if you would like to using that hashtag social contract. Okay, so we've had almost 80% of attendees vote at the moment. So I think we will stop there. It doesn't seem to be going up. So a few shy people, or maybe people who are waiting to listen to the panelists before they decide which things might be most important. So I'm just going to quickly share the results. So what did people think could have the biggest impact on rebuilding the social contract? Investment in skills and training and a more generous welfare state seem to be the most popular items. Perhaps not surprising given coronavirus and the impact, but lots of still a few other votes for some of the other more specific options as well. So I'm going to stop sharing those and remove that from the screen. So hopefully we have everyone through now. So I will do the proper introductions. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this morning. We are at Reform making this a habit for a Friday morning, which is a great habit to have, I think. So as I said, I'd introduce properly the speakers. For anyone who doesn't know who I am, I'm Charlie Pickles. I am director here at Reform Think Tank. I'm thrilled, as I said, to be joined by really a more than qualified set of speakers this morning to talk about what we can do to rebuild the social contract. I'm joined by Caroline Flint, who of course doesn't need any introduction, but I will do so anyway. Former cabinet minister, indeed I think a minister in 5 different government departments under the new Labour government. Also, of course, until December, MP for a red wall seat. And so we'll have a rich knowledge of some of the challenges facing some of those communities that have been dubbed slightly left behind, and probably facing some of the issues that we might discuss today. What I find fascinating, has talked about the need for I think it was a muscular economic nationalism. So I'm very interested in what that might mean for today's discussion. We're also joined by Nick Timothy, again, no introduction needed, but former Joint Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Theresa May, commentator, columnist, and author of Rethinking One Nation. So again, incredibly relevant to the discussion today. Also author of what I think will go down as actually one of the best manifestos, despite what some people's comments have been, the 2017 manifesto, which did talk about the fact that we need to curb untrammeled free markets. So something I hope we might talk about today, and has talked about the need for a civic capitalism. So again, interesting to see if we can pick up a bit on what that might actually mean in practice. And then finally, but absolutely not least, delighted to be joined by Martin Sambu, who is the Financial Times European economics commentator, but also has a new book out. And the main reason why I was so delighted that Martin, you would join us today, because that book is called The Economics of Belonging, which seems to bring together, excuse me, the two kind of, I guess, most important themes, which is what should the economy look like to make it work for everyone, but also how do you do that more cultural, social sense, which perhaps has driven some of the frustration amongst parts of the population. So, as I said, more than qualified to talk about the topic. So what is the topic? Very, very briefly, as you all haven't come to listen to me this morning, you've come to listen to our panelists. But the idea of the economy not working for everyone is certainly not a new concept. Indeed, for decades now, we have seen frustrations for various different reasons. There are a couple of polls which have been done within the last decade, which I think are particularly revealing for this topic. So firstly, that 3/4 of people in Britain think that the economy is rigged to benefit those who are rich and powerful, 3/4. And also that 2/3 of people think that in a capitalist economy, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, which are pretty damning perceptions by the British people, but probably not entirely unfair. So if you think about what we have seen over the last few decades, we have seen stagnating living standards. Indeed, the IFS this week put out some analysis which showed that median weekly wages were lower in 2019 than they were in 2007. We've seen stagnating social mobility. We've seen many inequalities actually increase during this period. So it's actually not surprising that people are feeling that perhaps the model we currently have isn't working. And of course, absolutely central to that is the idea of a social contract between the state, between individuals, and between businesses. So there's an awful lot within this that we could unpick, so many different areas, as we saw from the list in the poll, which was absolutely not exhaustive and was more me at the end of the day yesterday, just trying to off the top of my head come up with things. So much we could get into. Please do, as I say, put your questions into the Q&A, because that will help us shape the discussion to make sure you, as our audience, get out what you want from it. But without further ado, I do want to just ask each of our speakers to do a few opening remarks to set the context and to identify what they each think might be some of the most important issues within this topic. So Caroline, if I can ask you first of all.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Well, events matter. And I suppose I'll start by saying is what we know that we didn't know 6 months ago is that COVID-19 has blown away all assumptions about growth after Brexit. It's likely to lead to a sustained fall in GDP twice the scale of the banking crash. And we know too, as you've intimated already, that whilst we're all in this pandemic together, some have been hit harder than others, not only in terms of the health impacts, but also socially and economically. My first observation is, which people might find a bit depressing, is that in the short term, there won't be a settlement, not a meaningful planned settlement of any kind, such as created after World War II. My best guess is that the first consequence of this crisis will be chaos, a bit of a mess, as people look around for answers that aren't easy in any of this, and weren't easy actually before this COVID-19 crisis hit us. unemployment is going to rise sharply, and the pain of unemployment won't fall fairly. We know that. So for me, demand for how we rebuild jobs and skills has to be a top priority. Now, all kinds of companies will fail, and many will be turning to government, big players and small, not only for more bailouts and extensions, but also to support some of the efforts that have been made already, which have been greatly, I think, received by most. But we know who wins in those situations. It's not the village pub, the local butcher, or even some medium-sized manufacturers, such as some of the ones that I have here in Doncaster. It's usually the large players, the big guys, the defence, the aeronautical firms, the pharmaceutical industries, the car factories. They're the big players who often are heard most and who are most talked about, I have to say, when we come to these discussions. Second, when things settle, I think one argument should have been the one that says that governments actually matter. Now, twice in 10 years, the government's been called upon to save the economy. Only 10 years ago, when bankers brought our economy and others to its knees. And now we have a health crisis that is putting society in jeopardy. But in times of war crisis, what it is reminding us, it is only governments that have pockets deep enough and the authority and will to step in and save the day. We're already experiencing record government intervention, and we'll see spending and borrowing such as there's never seen before in our lifetime. But will the right choices be made to create an economic and social settlement that everyone believes they have a stake in? What the pandemic has also revealed is the value of people we often pay lip service to. Now, beyond NHS staff, essential workers include shop workers, delivery drivers, and of course, care workers. Many of those people are on low pay with insecure contracts. Lots of semi-casual workers are going to lose their jobs. They receive little training to do their job or even move on to a new job. Others, like care workers, despite the outpouring of, quite rightly, support and, pride for what they have been doing over the last few months, they overwhelmingly work in the private sector but earn less than NHS healthcare assistants, and they're less likely to be in a trade union. Now, that hasn't helped the care recruitment crisis that existed before this pandemic. And maybe if they had been a more integral part of the NHS, they would have been paid more, but also their needs and the needs of those they care for would have had greater priority. If we really want to value all of those who keep society going, we've got to look again at workers' rights and pay. And if the future involves more of us working from home, and I'm not just talking about policy wonks, I'm talking about people on the end of the phone that we ring up to renew our insurance contracts and all those sort of things. We need to establish a framework which is both fair to the employer, but also fair to the employee as well, because, when you're working from home, you're saving some costs for the employers when all's said and done. It's exposed more than ever, this pandemic, that equality matters. The health impact on vulnerable community needs to ensure that we have to focus and reinvest in preventative healthcare and helping people to be the healthiest they can be. But it has also brought home the damage to our poorer children during lockdown. An inclusive society going forward has to address access to technology as being essential, not just for children, but for older people as well, those in work who need to retrain and train on the job. But broadband and support have to go hand in hand with that. For our children, there's got to be a massive recovery programme to address the setbacks facing those children during this time. And finally, Charlie, we need to rebalance our economy. I'd hope that on the poll, this would go further up the wish list, but let me put it out there. COVID-19 has exposed our weaknesses. We can't even manufacture our own PPE, let alone vaccines. That rebuilding jobs in the regions means making and selling more, creating wealth to help us pay for the other things that public services provide. It's not about devolution of powers to regions versus big government. It's got to be a combination of both. And we need to help our regions become more productive. We're good at making things. It still provides 45% of our exports and 2/3 of investment in R&D. And let's be very clear, it pays better than average wages and creates local supply chains. New investment, power technology, equipment, skills for manufacturing, that's going to help a fairer recovery. Beyond the immediate fallout from this virus that may be with us for a long time, the agenda is huge. But if we're going to have a fairer settlement that convinces this country that what we're going through is worth the separation from loved ones, the pain and sorrow, it's got to be a fairer one than we've had before. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, a huge amount in there. And I'm also quite delighted, which people might be surprised to hear me say, that you mentioned trade unions. And I hope we might talk about those as well later. Super. I am just going to say, before I go to Nick, I have been corrected on the Q&A that actually affordable housing came top in our poll. Apologies, I didn't, having told everybody else to scroll down, I didn't take my own advice. So there we go. Actually affordable housing, which is probably quite instructive. Anyway, Nick, please, your comments.
Cool, thanks. And how do I follow that very comprehensive contribution from Caroline? I mean, I think the pandemic changes so much of our public life, and there will undoubtedly be huge debates about the nature of globalization, industrial strategy, regional rebalancing, the nature of modern supply chains, and things like that. But what I thought I'd quickly say at the beginning is a bit narrower than that, and relates more to the asks we might have sort of directly of business in a new contract. And I mean, I agree with what Caroline said about that. This is the second time the taxpayer has been asked to bail out business in a little bit more than a decade. And while nobody thinks that the pandemic is the fault of business or specific businesses in the way that the banking crisis was connected to the behaviour of the big international banks, it is obviously a big reminder that we are interdependent. We stand or fall together, and we need the scale of the state in extremis, but we also need the scale of the state to drive change in our economy when it comes to things like the regional balance of our economy. And it's a reminder, especially to some libertarians in the political party of which I'm a member, that no business succeeds alone. It is completely dependent on other businesses. It's dependent on the state providing public services. It's dependent on community, strong families to bring up children and to contribute towards their education, to provide the sort of skilled and educated workers of the future. We're completely interdependent, but too often our policy doesn't really reflect that, and we treat business as though it's sort of stands alone. I was just going to suggest three quick things for now. And the first thing is reform of corporate governance, which I've argued for quite a long time, to try to make businesses much more respectful of the needs of their workers, their customers, and the local communities that they operate within. In Britain, we have quite a dispersed and transient model of share ownership compared to other European countries, and our executive classes are less accountable as a result of that, and shareholders find it harder to hold them to account, but also to make sure that sort of firms are sort of rooted in community and mindful of responsibilities. So I would like to see a corporate governance that allows for proper representation of the interests of workers and consumers. The second thing I was going to say was the role that businesses play in education and training, including the reskilling of people whose jobs are threatened by new technologies. I mean, Britain, I think, has a pretty terrible record when it comes to providing young people with technical education and skills, and as technology changes, our pretty poor provision when it comes to adult reskilling will be exposed even more. That is the fault as much of successive governments as it is of business, but we need to do something to move away from the kind of high immigration, low skill, low wage model that we have at the moment. In a way, Brexit prompts this question, but that so too does the economic problem that we find ourselves in at the moment. And then the third thing I was going to say was is much more of a general point about the values of business leaders. It obviously isn't unreasonable to expect companies and senior corporate leaders to pay their taxes, we can look at the ways in which taxes are levied, but we also need to do something about making sure that when taxes are set by government, that they are paid properly and in full. And as firms are not only in the receipt of significant sums of public money, they'll also be laying off quite a lot of workers in the coming months. And I would think that it would be morally important for business leaders to share some of the pain by reducing some of their salary costs as well. I think there's a really strong principled argument for a new contract and a new relationship, but actually there's also a fairly narrow political one, because I think if we bail out big business again without seeking changes to wider corporate culture, politicians, I think, can expect a pretty serious reckoning from an electorate which will not only be sort of displeased and judgmental, but quite traumatized after we've gone through this pretty significant public health crisis and the economic crisis that will follow.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And again, loads for us to unpack in it. The point about the political reckoning. I mean, it is important to remind ourselves, despite the landslide Conservative victory, that in the previous election, Corbynomics was incredibly popular, and not least because of many of these issues that we're talking about. Fantastic, thank you. And Martin, over to you.
Thanks very much. My fellow panelists are both hard acts to follow, but I thought I could try and complement a bit by giving a bit of an international perspective, and I think that might also tease out some of the differences between us, because I mean, I think we all agree that the social contract has failed, not just here, but in many countries, and that there's a need to rebuild something in which every citizen of the country feels that the economy works for them, that in some sense a common economy, what I call an economy of belonging, that everyone feels they have a decent place in. But how we get there is probably where we have the most interesting differences. I'd like to highlight that while we are now, of course, in the middle of a very acute crisis, and for a couple of years before that, we had been talking about the precariat, the people who fall by the wayside and so on, who are precisely those who are the most badly hit by the economic fallout from COVID. This is actually a very long process of unraveling. It's about 40 years in the making that we've seen increased economic polarization. And we see that not just in the UK. This is a phenomenon that you see in pretty much every country of what we used to call the industrialized world, where you have, on a lot of dimensions in the economy, you had a process of convergence in the 3 decades roughly after the war, up until about 1980, and a process of divergence after that. You see that in increased wage inequality, you see it in wealth inequality, you see it, and this we don't talk enough about, you see it in regional inequality, where along all these dimensions, you had people growing together, the economy bringing people together, the worst of catching up until about 1980, and then people growing apart in most countries to different degrees, but still in most countries since about 1980. Now, the timing of this is one of the reasons why I think it's wrong to blame globalization for this. It started earlier, what I call the end of belonging. This beginning of economic polarization started well before globalization, either in the form of trade with poor countries or large-scale immigration of lower skilled, lower paid labor started in the 90s and 2000s. So the timing doesn't add up, and you can also see that some of the countries that have navigated this the best, and I consider the European Nordics though to be those countries, I'll say a bit more about them, are also very open countries. What it does seem to align with is the end of mass industrial employment. I try to avoid using the word deindustrialization because there's a bit of a trap there. In every industrialized country, the number of factory jobs peaked in the late 1970s, give or take 5 years, plus minus 5 years. It's quite astonishing, this phenomenon. You see this everywhere. You see it in the US, you see it in the UK, you see it across Western Europe. That is not the same as saying that industrial production, that industry itself disappeared. And it didn't disappear. In pretty much every country, industrial production, output, volumes, the amount of stuff made in factories kept growing through the 1980s, through the 1990s, even through the 2000s in some cases. Ups and downs, of course, recessions were always bad, but on the whole, most Western countries produce as much or more stuff, physical stuff, as they ever had. It's just they don't have a lot of industrial jobs anymore. And what that means is that what's changed, this is the definition of productivity, right? Manufacturing has become ever more productive. You need ever fewer hands to produce these things. And the jobs that remain, they're sophisticated, high skill, high value added, and also often well-paid jobs. But there aren't that many of them, and there never will be that many of them. So when people talk about, I'm a bit skeptical when people talk about rebalancing the economy in that sense. We should not expect or even try to get back to mass industrial employment with lots of hands on assembly lines. That's probably impossible, and it's not desirable even if we could. It's technology that's at the root of this. It's not just in industry. Of course, computers have got rid of a lot of clerical jobs. The internet is threatening in-person retail jobs and so on. So it's basically been a change in productive technology that has changed economic structures for 4 decades, but in ways that have created inequalities because of the sort of jobs that have the highest value added today, kind of high-skilled, high cognitive content, often machine or capital-intensive jobs. They tend to benefit different kinds of people with higher educational backgrounds. They tend to benefit different places. They thrive more in the big cities, whereas the optimal scale for industry could be a small town. So there are a lot of things that are just harder to deal with in order to create a national economy that everyone belongs to. I mean, that doesn't mean we can't do it. And so let me talk a little bit about comparing the UK with the Nordics. Nick mentioned immigration, which is one area where he and I disagrees. I'd like people in the audience to answer this question if they know the answer. Which country had the highest immigration of labor from Eastern Europe after 2004 as a share of the population, the UK or Norway? So the answer I will tell you is Norway. There was more East European immigration, labor immigration to Norway than the UK, and yet it never became this very difficult, divisive political issue in Norway as it did in the UK, especially in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. Why was that? I think it's because in Norway you haven't had the growth of very poor, low productivity, low skilled, low paid, labor intensive business models that you have in the UK. So what is the difference between these styles of economies? One thing that Norway did, which the UK didn't, was to, there isn't a minimum wage in Norway, but there was effectively the same on a sectoral basis because the Norwegian government said, well, let's take the bargained wages from collective bargaining and by administrative fiat impose that in sectors like cleaning and some other sectors where there was quite a lot of immigrant labor. There were policies put in place to stop a downward pressure on wages and on work standards. This was true in this episode with large immigration from Eastern Europe, but it's also been true over the decades. And there's a very big difference here between an economic model that permits, allows, even encourages businesses to opt for production methods that use low paid but low productivity labor intensively and those that don't. So what you see in the Nordics is that a lot of types of jobs that are used in Britain are just not economically viable for employers in the Nordics because wages are too high. But I think we can flip that around. These jobs don't exist to the same extent in the Nordics because wages are too high. High wages incentivizes businesses to choose different production methods, to invest more in capital, to automate more, to create jobs where each amount of labor, each job, each human activity actually is more productive and therefore can be paid better. And I think that's where we want to reach. I don't want to say that the Nordics are perfect. They're not. And if people are interested, we can talk about that. But that's the kind of general direction. What that means is that you don't want to resist technological growth and productivity growth. You want to work with the grain of productivity growth. Again, don't try to recreate the jobs of the past. Try instead to create as many of as you can of the jobs of the future, and try to create them in as wide and as large a part of the country as you can. There are a couple of ingredients to a policy that can get you that way. I mean, I think of it a little bit as the Nordic secret sauce. How did they manage to combine high levels of equality with high productivity growth? Well, one reason is that wage equality, high wages at the bottom end, was a reason for investing in technology and making jobs more productive. It created these incentives. And there's sort of a trace of this in the, since 2015, the Osborne policy of pushing up what is called the national living wage in the UK, and that conservative governments have stuck with. It's an idea that you can push this up and actually businesses will adapt and become more productive so that they can afford to pay for it. So far, it's played out pretty well. But I think we need more of this. We should be more ambitious on minimum wages and wage floors generally. And this goes not just for wage levels, but for employment standards. There was a question in your poll about greater protections for workers. I was glad to see that was pretty high up the scale. I think that's tremendously important. And I think it will have the same effect as higher minimum wages, namely it will force businesses to adopt production ways of doing things that are more productive, that don't rely on essentially exploiting vulnerable, low-paid labor. That means some of the current jobs will disappear, or that some of the current businesses will disappear. But that's something we should embrace. What we need is a system in place that creates other things in their place. What those other things are, of course, skill levels. The others have talked about that. Very important. What you see in the Nordics is that they spend more on education as a share of GDP at all levels than pretty much every other advanced country. And they get the results. They have higher skill levels, and particularly these sort of general basic skills of literacy, numeracy, and now digital aptitude that allow somebody to learn new things and adapt. Another thing that the Nordics have that isn't as well known is that they actually have quite a lot of job churn. So look at all European countries. The two countries with the highest rate of job-to-job moves within a period, a quarter, a year, are Denmark and Sweden. There's a lot of job churn. And that's a good thing, because that is what allows people to move from bad jobs to better jobs. So you want to have that sort of smoothness in the labor market. We think of the UK labor market as particularly flexible, but in this regard, it's not. One reason for that is that people depend on their jobs in a way that, you know, we have a lot of people who are in such a precarious situation that they cannot afford to take a week or two off to look for a better job, or take a month off to retrain themselves, or to take a course, because they are living to such an extent hand to mouth that they are stuck in the job they have. We see this in the terrible problems with universal credit, that this 4 or 5 week delay is devastating, right? There are people who basically fall off because of this very short period of time and don't have the economic buffer. So we need policies to make it possible to leave a job, to say no to bad conditions and look for a new one. So that means a better welfare system. I'm in favor of a universal basic income. That is, of course, a very controversial policy, but I'm in favor of it because it gives us power to say no and leave. Final thing, and then I finish. You need a strong aggregate demand policy. You should not take your foot off the accelerator until there is strong job growth and strong growth in the right kinds of jobs. That was very important in and a big failure in the recovery from the global financial crisis. And it risks being a big failure this time around. It's the last thing anyone should do is to stop stimulating aggregate demand. I'll stop there. I'm probably over time already, but I hope I've presented a couple of provocative ideas at least.
Certainly some provocative ideas. I think we can definitely say that. Thank you. And very interesting with the kind of international comparisons and what we might or might not be able to learn. I'm sure there's loads of things that everybody would like to come back on in each of the panelists' contributions. But I wonder if we could start with this question of rebalancing and what the role of government might be in it. So each of you commented on the need for thinking about the regional inequalities rather than kind of other sorts of group inequalities. It could be said that historically government hasn't been particularly good, although it has tried at times to do some of this rebalancing. Is this, you know, how do you try and drive growth in areas that are to some degree stagnating? What is the role of industrial strategy? You know, is it about incentives for businesses? How might we start to see success in this when we really have seen deterioration over several decades? I wonder, Caroline, as I know that you've kind of strongly endorsed this idea of shifting towards more presumably high value manufacturing, but how do you think government could go about actually achieving that?
Well, I think part of it is, and this isn't new, is looking at the divisions, if you like, between what the north of England gets in terms of support for transport and infrastructure compared to London and the south of England. And just to say, I've never wanted to get into we hate London, we love the north. I was born in London, although my family are from the north. But you know, we do really have to recognise that it is not a level playing field by any stretch whatsoever. And then I think, you know, there are some aspects of what's happening in the north of England which is really successful. We're not victims here, in the sense that there is some great stuff going on. So it's about looking more deeply into what's stopping us being better than we are already and to be more productive. And part of that as well is looking at the inequity inside regions as well. A city region strategy, I understand the logic of that, but unfortunately, the same criticisms that are made of London and Whitehall and Westminster could be made of some of the people involved in that. They sort of almost thought, we'll build it in the city and everyone shall come. So we need to look, I think, clearly at how do we provide connectivity? That's one aspect of it, but it's not the whole answer. That could mean just everyone from Doncaster going to work in York, Leeds or Sheffield, for example. But it's about looking at what are some of the problems there. We have problems in terms of getting good teachers in our towns around the country, not just Yorkshire. So what do we do to incentivise the best young teachers to come and work in those communities? Just like in London, they've successfully got great teachers working in the most challenging parts of London. How do we make sure we invest in broadband technology when so many of our towns around the country, you can't even work from home because you haven't got that connection there? Because when it comes to the broadband operators, they don't get enough for their buck because the population isn't as dense as a city. So I think there's lots of ways we could be looking at levelling the playing field in terms of investment, surely, but also looking more closely in some areas which actually aren't a big fix in the sense of requiring a huge amount of change, but more focused on what areas actually need. And I think devolution is part of that as well. Skills is something that could be done better by a region basis, looking at what works in a region. I used to be Shadow Secretary for Energy and Climate Change for nearly 5 years. And one of the, well, it was a challenging brief, but one of the joys of that brief is what it brought home to me is, unlike other areas, energy is something that plays across the country. It doesn't have to be London or Southeast based. It really has an offer, whether it's renewable energy or putting solar panels on your roof, or big factors like nuclear, for example, or offshore wind, onshore wind, to those parts of the country for whom some of our, you know, more prominent manufacturers and business players just don't see a role for themselves in those communities. So I think some of those aspects could make a difference.
And Nick, I mean, the point that Caroline makes there, which is that, you know, it might be great if Manchester and Birmingham do well, but actually how do you get the towns and the, you know, perhaps more rural areas to see success, and therefore for people in those areas, I'm thinking particularly coastal areas as well, where actually the jobs on the whole are very low paid service sector roles. You know, will industrial strategy actually deliver any benefit for those people?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by industrial strategy. I mean, it's quite easy to say you're in favour of industrial strategy, but there are lots of different ways of delivering it. I mean, you know, I think one of the interesting things that we're yet to learn about the Boris government is there seems to be a commitment to industrial strategy in some form, but we don't quite know what it looks like yet. We know it's going to involve lots of public investment in transport infrastructure. We know it's going to involve some investment in R&D budgets and science. But we don't know we don't know what else it really means yet in terms of how interventionist the government might be in different scenarios, the extent to which it will prioritise sort of regional rebalancing in some of the decisions it makes, We don't know whether it's about sort of cities or whether there's a sort of clearly thought through strategy for improving towns. I mean, I think, you know, when we talk about towns, I think we've got to be quite clear that you know, the problems that towns face are incredibly diverse. So, you know, you can be a relatively prosperous town next to a poor city. You can be the reverse. You can be a remote town like Blackpool that struggles because of its kind of remoteness, but also because, you know, the state has taken to using places like Blackpool as a bit of a social dumping ground where it's a cheap place to send problem families, and then you end up with incredibly sort of transient school populations and things like that. I mean, on towns, I mean, I think we need to try to think of strategies that take in the needs of the cities and the towns around them, and a big part of that will have to be the devolution of power, because you certainly don't want a situation where government departments, which, to be honest, you know, are quite often not very good at delivering even the things that they need to be at a national level, are trying to presuppose the needs of specific cities and towns. And I know Caroline mentioned skills budgets earlier. I think that's an obvious example. I mean, on the subject of what industrial strategy actually is, I mean, there's one particular problem I think that we have with, especially with the kind of knowledge economy, which is this kind of first mover problem. So, you know, London has all the benefits of agglomeration, but you know, certain cities in the region have the kind of opposite effect, where they've lost some of their big employers, they lose some of their most talented people. It's not just the sort of economic institutions they lose, the sort of more civic institutions decline as well. And, you know, if we could all say, well, a particular city would really benefit from a particular kind of cluster of industry, but no new business or no international business would necessarily look at a city that's struggling in that way and think that they'll be the first ones to move there. So I think there's a role for the state, I think, in trying to work out how it can be the first mover sometimes to try to start off some of these benefits of agglomeration in cities. And one of the things I've argued for in the past is that if we look through in a kind of thematic way the different things the state does and the different public bodies and state agencies that exist, and by this I don't mean sort of, you know, we should move a DWP call center to Oldham or somewhere. I mean, like doing something like properly structural with big change, where you could say, well, you know, there is a group of economic regulators, or there's groups of research and data organizations, or there's the NHS and all the different health bodies. You could bring them together, and, you know, there would be dozens of these things. You could bring these sort of clusters of organizations together and invite the city regions to come forward and bid to be the sort of host city for those things, and you could transfer them on the basis that a particular city had the best sort of economic spatial plan. It matches the expertise of the university. They've got a strategy to try to promote the spillover effects from those public bodies into the private sector, because I don't think we can just sit around waiting for big businesses to suddenly decide that, you know, the West Midlands or South Yorkshire or wherever is the place where they're going to, you know, sort of consciously start these clusters, because it doesn't work like that.
Thank you. I want to move on to a different subject, Martin, to start with you, which is this idea of how do we deal with this corporate governance, sort of business with a purpose, responsible capitalism type agenda? Martin, you talked about some of the stuff around collective bargaining and kind of sort of sector-based wages, but there's clearly big challenges in how some businesses operate. You mentioned the sort of period of the 1980s, which obviously was also when we saw the rise of shareholder value maximization and some of the perhaps more negative impacts that's had around pay, lack of investment, short-termism, all those kind of things. So I suppose there's a massive opening question. What are your thoughts about some of the practical steps that business and government could take in order to deliver more responsible corporate behaviour that could help rebuild this social contract?
Yeah, as you say, it's a sort of massive question because it depends what is the kind of corporate misbehavior you're most concerned about. But, call me old-fashioned, but I think one good place to start is to enforce the law. And if we're just talking about working conditions sort of on the ground, I mean, it's kind of shocking how uninterested the British government seems to be, or the British state, I should say, seems to be in enforcing its own laws. It's rife with abuse, and we know that. But, there are some good laws on the book. I mean, take the minimum wage laws, for example. You could actually start by simply enforcing that. And I think you'd have a lot of good effects. And not just that people would start being paid what they're legally owed, but the kind of business adaptation towards more productive ways of organizing their businesses that I've talked about. And then, of course, you want to improve those laws while you enforce them. Nick also mentioned tax collection. It's a similar example, right? Of course, there are tax laws. Enforce them. They're not being sufficiently or universally enforced at the moment. This takes resources, but they're resources that pay for themselves. You want to probably improve the requirements, again, thinking about the workplace. I think you should shift some risk by law away from employees onto employers. So that means, putting some limits on what kind of contracting is allowed, the predictability of shift patterns, that sort of thing. And as long as you enforce that, I think the international experience shows that businesses adapt. This is the thing, incentives work, markets tend to work, capitalism is pretty good at responding to incentives. And the first role of a government in a capitalist system is to put the right rules in place and then let businesses adapt. And the best ones will, right? And if that means you outcompete, some businesses can't work viably anymore because they could only make a profit if they exploited employees, then so be it. That's a good thing. Beyond that, I talked about the Nordics, where, of course, the unions still have a very prominent place. In most countries outside of Scandinavia, you've seen a huge decline in union membership, union coverage. And that's not something you can easily change. That is partly because the sort of jobs where unions were strong have disappeared. And as I said, they will not come back. It's partly because some of the work styles we have now, if you think about the gig economy, it's harder to organize. So, if you're from a union movement or labor movement background, you will want to bring back or strengthen unions. Fair enough. I'd rather not wait for that, but see if there are policy substitutes, if you like, ways that policy can perform the functions that unions at their best in the past or in other countries have fulfilled. So in terms of representation, in terms of worker protection and so on. But also, if you believe me that about how a modern economy has to actually involve a lot of job changes, maybe what you need is a sort of system of portability of rights, for example, so that you're not actually dependent on your job for representation or rights the way that unions would be good at putting through, but instead you need a set of policies that basically make it not matter too much whether you're working in a string of short-term jobs rather than one permanent job. So there are a lot of things you can do to not just improve governance at the company level, but substitute for what used to be done at corporate level and in the collaboration between unions and employers.
Thank you. And Nick, before I come to Caroline, I mean, corporate governance was one of your 3 points at the start. And I remember when John McDonnell gave his conference speech, I think it was last year, he had a great turn of phrase, which was that workers should have a say and a stake in companies, which I wholeheartedly agree with, although perhaps his conclusion I was less supportive of. But that concept of how do you enable, we've seen the balance of power and pay massively shift towards capital and executives. How do we start to shift that back?
Well, I think corporate governance reform is one of the first places that we should start. I remember when I persuaded Theresa to make this commitment in the Tory leadership election, that we'd have workers on boards, and then when we won and got into Downing Street, I remember Philip Hammond as Chancellor, his face dropped when he realised that we meant it. And it sort of got back to me that he used to go around saying it's another one of Nick Timothy's wacky ideas. To me, this is actually entirely intuitive as a conservative, that you should think that corporate governance should be strong and that people should be represented better through board reform. Partly because, I assume unless you're the hardest core of libertarians, you actually do accept that there should be certain standards and certain protections for workers and ways in which companies take into account, the externalities of what they do. And you can do this. You can do this by trying to micromanage absolutely everything and second guess behavior by coming up with thousands of regulations. Of course, I think I'm not somebody who argues for sort of massive deregulation of the economy, but corporate governance is about setting the rules, creating a framework which would then make companies behave better, make better decisions, look after people better, and then you don't have to be quite so sort of statist and interventionist through the way you regulate.
Thank you very much. I want to come on to the question of welfare, as that was very popular, but and I will start, Caroline, with you. But before we go on to welfare, just very briefly, Caroline, I wonder if I can ask this point about unionisation, and even the Bank of England have pointed, it's a great graph showing the correlation, if not cause, between, kind of declining union membership and declining wages, because we don't, workers don't have that power to bargain anymore. But it's interesting, Martin made the point that sort of partly it's because the jobs where unions used to be have disappeared. But is there not an onus on the unions themselves to then be able to support the new private sector jobs? So just very briefly on that, because I do want to, in the last few minutes we have gone to welfare, but your perspective on whether unions also need to step up at the same time as businesses do.
I'll make two brief points on that. One is undoubtedly the heyday of trade unions was when we did have, in a town like Doncaster, everyone, when I say everyone, all the men worked in coal mines pretty much and railroads. It's far easier, let's be honest, it's far easier to organise a trade union in those situations, or in the steel industry, a chemical industry in the northeast where my husband's from, and so on, than it is today, with everything much more fragmented than it ever was. In retail, really quite difficult outside of, say, for example, the big Asda's and the other big stores and chains, to organise a high street in terms of trade unions. So that is a problem, and I think unions are still trying to grapple with that. I've always thought that part of what the offer should be from trade unions is recognising that for some people, look, I used to work for a trade union, in another life I was a shop steward, but for some people, I've been in the Labour Party for 4 years, but for some people, if you like, for want of a better word, the baggage of all the politics and affiliations and that isn't what they join a trade union for. The best thing a union has to sell to people is an insurance policy that when you're under the cosh and you're not being treated fairly, there is someone you can go to provide you with the best services possible, to sit with you in that room with your manager to help you. And I therefore think there's something about, how are unions going to still adapt to a changing world of work in which people want to join a union, or they think they might, or something like it, but at the moment that bridge isn't being created for them to see a union as the answer. The other side of it is trying to change the tone of debate between employers and sometimes government and trade unions. Lots of unions every day. The energy industry is an example. The nuclear industry wouldn't be as good as it is in the UK without what I would say is a really great economic and social contract between the trade unions and their work members and the management and those organisations to make sure it's safe, to make sure it's productive and it works well. Similarly in the car industry too. So changing the tone in this I think is really important, from one that is less adversarial but is much more about what works. And when it comes to organisations, can I just say something very quickly on the corporate governance? Corporate governance, transparency. I would like it to be the aim of every business that when they do their annual reports, the first page says, we pay our tax and we're proud to pay our tax. Next thing could be also, this is how we treat our employees in terms of wages, and there's transparency there. But importantly for the big companies is their impact on all those people that work in their buildings or work for them, but not directly to them. And there's been an awful lot of outsourcing of the years, of cleaning, of other low paid jobs, in which the big firms and the banks can say, aren't we wonderful? Everyone's paid above the living wage. But in truth, that isn't the truth, because so many of the workforce they rely on just aren't paid by them. And so I think there is, you know, a combination of factors at play here that do demand more. And Nick is absolutely right. We shouldn't be paying out anything in the future without some more obligations tied to it. And here's one on immigration. I think there's still going to be a need for immigration, but when we set up these visas sector by sector and we enable employers to take on migrant workers, they have to show that they are training within their organisations to sustain their existing workforce, but allow more people from the closest community to be able to vie for those jobs.
Great. I love it when there's a practical idea that we could actually do. That's great. Thank you. I am conscious we're actually about 2 minutes away from where we're supposed to stop. I would never normally do this, but the welfare question is obviously a massive one that several people in the Q&A have asked. So if our panelists could spare us an extra 5 minutes, then perfect. Thank you. Then I would just like to ask you this, but if I can ask you to keep your answers very, very brief. Clearly, one of the things that coronavirus has exposed is the inadequacy for most people of the level of welfare that is in place. Martin, you mentioned a UBI. We could certainly spend at least 5 hours discussing the pros and cons of that. But just from each of the panelists, do we need a massive overhaul? And I'm reluctant to say that after we've just done that with universal credit, but do we need a different type of model of welfare that provides a much better public safety net, which is core part of the social contract? Because we have seen certain groups, which is some of the comments we're seeing coming through, having been particularly impacted as a result of the economic impact of coronavirus. As I said, if I could ask you to keep your answers very brief, although it is a massive, massive topic, I'm aware. But Martin, perhaps starting with you, given that you went out to, you know, one of the more radical ends of the ideas that are around.
You ask if there's a need for radical overhaul, and I think the answer is yes, and in particular in the UK, although probably everywhere. But we saw in the pandemic that the UK had to create from scratch very fast something that's actually in place already in most continental and Nordic European countries in terms of sort of a high replacement rate when you lose your job, or an ability to be temporarily off work and covered. Every other country in Europe pretty much had that and just needed to expand the size. The UK had to scramble to put it together from scratch, but that shows the need for it. But more generally, and I will be quick, we need a big overhaul because much like unions were sort of based on the industrial economy and a lot of other things are based on the industrial economy, so is the welfare system, right? At a time when you had a male breadwinner, lifetime permanent employment situation, that's when the welfare system, as we know it, pretty much was created. And you see this in two ways. You see this in that welfare payments are linked to work, typically in most countries. You only get this help if you work. And the other thing is that it's means tested, you know, as you get better off, it's withdrawn. But that doesn't work for today's economy. One reason is because work itself has become more erratic. You find, and you see this with universal credit, a sort of work-linked welfare benefit can actually worsen the earnings volatility that a lot of people face. It's a perverse effect of that previous system. And means testing, of course, means that a lot of people at the sort of lower to middle end of the pay scale face effective tax rate up to 80, 90% if you include the withdrawal of benefits. If you impose those tax rate for high earners, there would be, an outcry. But there really should be an outcry about that being the effective situation for people who, try to do what they can to improve their situation and get punished for it. So those are two reasons why I think you need to break the link with work, you need to break the means testing, and that leaves you with some sort of UBI style thing.
Caroline, if I can come to you, one of the things obviously that New Labour, and I think you were a Minister for Employment, if I'm remembering correctly, yes. One of the things that New Labour really tried to do was actually shift the narrative towards a something for something welfare system, which is sort of the opposite end of what Martin is talking about. And we've completely undermined the contributory principle in this country, and essentially for people on anything other than, earning the sort of around the minimum wage, the replacement rate is terrible. Should we be going to universal, or do you think there is still a desire in this country to have a something for something system?
Call me old fashioned, but I sort of think actually work is still really important. I think it's about, without taking anything what I've said about government intervention, by the way, I still think the interventions that we make in government, in schools and everything else, about enabling as much as possible to enable people to look after themselves and their families. And some people are going to need, despite work, more help and assistance to do that. And I think two factors I would pick on are where we are failing and have been failing some time. One is on housing, a decent home for people to live in. When those first council estates were built and everything, they were often linked to an employer locally, but they're about sustaining people in work. And likewise, the other area I think we're failing on, when I was employment minister and thinking about, I always used to think, well, there was a lot of quite middle class people, liberal people, decrying people doing cleaning jobs. Oh my God, cleaning is really important. It is so important in terms of what we're dealing with at the moment in terms of infections. But on the other hand, it goes to Martin's point. Very often those people who do take that low paid job because they just want to work aren't enabled to move on within that sector or to move to another sector as they get more confidence and their skills grow. That is fundamentally a weakness that we have at the moment. So I would like to see much more, not just for people who are out of work and an awful lot of people on employment support allowance where there's a whole number of other issues going on there about access to work, but also people in work are given resources to improve their skills, either within the workplace or out of the workplace. And if necessary, whilst they are unemployed, enabled to actually go and do a intensive course of study rather than, and then taken off them some of the pressures to find work in the next 13 weeks or so. Because for most people, that means them just going from a very similar job that's low paid, low skilled to another low paid skilled job. And for many people, that is not going to be an option in the future.
Thank you. And last words briefly then for Nick. A UBI?
Well, I'm glad you put it like that. Very briefly, I am vehemently opposed to UBI because, as Caroline says, I think work really matters for all sorts of reasons. I do note Martin's argument for a UBI is actually to encourage people, to give people the ability and confidence to move within jobs, which I think is actually a better argument for a UBI than those normally made. But nonetheless, I still disagree with it. And I think the suggestion that Caroline just made is probably a more realistic and a less risky outcome. I do wonder whether we need to learn from the experience of the furlough. We know that lots of families, and absolutely not only the poorest families, but lots of families on fairly average wages have very little security and very little by way of savings, which means that if there is a shock in the family where mum or dad loses their job, then they're not going to be very well protected. And I do wonder whether we need to learn from the furlough scheme and have perhaps not exactly the system that's being created, but something with perhaps similar principles. And then just lastly, on the point of the furlough scheme, it's normally a convenient argument for a lot of people who don't want the state to do different things for ideological reasons to just argue that the state is just bloody useless and can't do things. The way in which the furlough scheme was created at such short notice and has been rolled out in a successful manner rather undermines that kind of argument.
Well, that's a great note to finish on. The government matters. So thank you very much. Okay, well, we are over time. I'm very grateful, Caroline, Martin and Nick, both for you doing this this morning and giving up your time, but also for allowing that little bit extra at the end just to make sure that we could cover one of the big topics that people were asking about. So thank you so much, really insightful. I'm certainly going to go away and look more at Norway and the Nordics and what they're doing, although I'm probably also on the end of not being quite near the UBI. But a really, really great discussion, and we've got some comments coming through saying that, so thank you. Can I thank also everybody who has tuned in on a Friday morning, a very muggy Friday morning, to listen to the discussion. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Do let us know any feedback or comments if you have it. If I may just mention, we also have another webinar next week, which is Justice After Lockdown, which is going to be very topical at the moment. Keep juries, don't keep juries, Nightingale courts, etc. And we have the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, David Lammy, joining us for that one. So I think we may already be oversubscribed, but there might be a few places. I'm sure my team will let me know. So if you did want to join us, please drop us an email. Otherwise, can I just say a massive thank you again? Genuinely such an interesting discussion. I hope we might in future do some more of these, sort of doing a bit more of a deep dive into some of the aspects, as it's clearly a hugely broad topic, but one that so many people are interested in and has become ever more important if it wasn't already important enough before coronavirus. So thank you so much. Thank you for watching, and hopefully we will see you again at the next webinar. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Bye-bye.